I want to swing back to the top story here on Parliament Hill. We opened the show with the controversy about the Fair Elections Act because today at a committee, the former BC Chief Electoral Officer, Harry Neufeld, the guy who wrote the report that Minister Pierre Poilievre keeps quoting, he thinks his report on elections has been taken out of context. Listen to the message, just at the beginning of this show, he has delivered to Minister Pierre Poilievre. Check this out.
Pierre, read the whole context. There's more to this. The Supreme Court says if there are irregularities, that's the first test. The second test is there has to be proof that people actually voted when they were not eligible to.
All right, pretty direct there. Elections expert Harry Neufeld, just a couple minutes ago on the program, accusing the Minister of State for Democratic Reform, Pierre Poilievre, of twisting his words in order to make the case for the controversial Election Act. He's also accusing the government of torquing evidence of voter fraud. Who's right in this increasing hostile war of words? And with a massive backlash against the bill, especially the plan to end vouching, is the government prepared to amend the legislation? Joining me now, the Minister of State for Democratic Reform, Pierre Poilievre. Good to see you, Minister.
Good to be with you.
All right, Harry Neufeld was just on the program before, and you saw the clip at the beginning, and he says, Pierre, using your first name, you're misquoting my report. You're selectively reading it to justify a position. He argues there is no evidence of voter fraud, and so in order to solve this, what you say, the issue of fraud, you're going to disenfranchise 120,000 voters. What do you say?
Well, I'd say, Harry, the rules exist for a reason. And in your report, on page 64, line 25, you indicate that they were violated 45,868 times. And then you go on to list other areas where they were violated with respect to vouching to bring it in a total of 50,735 irregularities, which Harry said were serious enough to have a court overturn an election or invalidate a vote.
But he says, when I put that quote to him, as you saw, and he responded, Pierre, as you two go back and forth, you could have come on together. He says, you are mistaking irregularities for fraud.
No, I'm not.
Well, this is what he says. He says there is no evidence of fraud. So where is the evidence of fraud?
So the rules exist to protect against fraud. And when those rules are systematically broken, the risk of fraud automatically goes up. Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example.
Your argument, though, is there could be fraud, but I have no evidence of fraud. The lack of evidence of fraud isn't a case for more rules against fraud.
The lack of following the rules, though, is. And what we know is that these rules exist for a reason. Let me give you one example. You're not allowed to vouch for more than one voter in an election. Because if you did, then you could vouch for a whole lot of people in a whole lot of different places and ultimately lead to multiple voting or permit ineligible voters to cast a ballot. When you have 45,000 cases where Elections Canada has no record of the voucher and the voter, then you can't track whether someone has vouched more than one time. And you risk having someone vote more than once or voting inelligibly. Now, the unique nature of voter fraud from other crimes is this. With car theft, you wake up in the morning and your car is missing. With vandalism, you arrive at your small business and your window's broken. You see the damage. When a fraudulent ballot falls into a ballot box, it mixes with all the other ballots, and it's very difficult to trace it, and it's impossible to reverse.
You are building a bill around a hypothetical.
No.
He's saying build it around evidence.
And the evidence is...
What is the evidence?
That the rules exist to prevent that fraudulent ballot from ever getting into the box in the first place.
But you have to have evidence for...
I
asked him.
Right.
I said, Mr. Neufeld.
Okay.
I asked Mr. Méron. I asked Mr. Kingsley, the current Chief Electoral Officer, the former Chief Electoral Officer, the guy whose report you keep quoting, and all of them say, Mr. Poilievre, there is no evidence of election fraud. And an example, you and I, you've been in the studio. You could have taken my wallet. I'm not going to ban you from the studio because you could have, because you didn't take it. So I don't ban you from the studio.
But here's the difference. If your wallet goes missing, you know it. If there's a fraudulent ballot in the box, you don't know it. And especially if as Elections Canada failed to keep records of vouchers and voters 45,868 times, it's impossible for them to know if vouchers did vouching more than once, or potentially if voters voted more than once.
But I asked Mr. Neufeld that, okay?
And that's why the reason these rules exist is to prevent fraud. When they're systematically broken, then you increase the risk of fraud.
But his point here is, if you think that this may have happened, if you really are fear that some kind of fraud may have taken place, then we'll investigate the complaint. And he says, the problem is, he said, when you file a complaint, we have investigated and we don't find anything. And he says they're urban myths. I mean, look, in your own caucus, you had Mr. Butt, who invented a situation where he saw voter fraud. He literally made it up out of thin air. You've got Lori Hahn, who today, another Conservative MP, alleges that there was potential voter fraud with the voter identification cards, and yet he didn't report it at the time.
Actually, he did. That's factually wrong. And
what happened? Well, he said, I wish I'd told that person to come forward.
Excuse me. He did report problems of voter registration back in 2006, and Elections Canada actually got involved, and as a result, they had to remove people from faulty addresses that would have allowed them.
No, but not the bundle of those VIC cards.
But that would have allowed them to vote at places where they did not live. So that example, which you just raised, actually strengthens the case for stronger rules for identification, because had Mr. Hahn not intervened, there might have been mass fraud in that particular riding. That case is very well documented.
But actually, doesn't it strengthen the rule that it works? If there's real issues, you make a complaint and it happens. But so far, there's not any evidence of voter fraud.
Right. So if you are a worker at a poll desk and somebody walks in to vote fraudulently and you don't know that person, you're operating based on the word of a voucher who you've never met. The safeguard is that you keep a record of who that voucher is, and in 45,000 cases that didn't happen in the last election. Let me just tell, just so your viewers who might be just tuning into this debate understand what we're proposing. We're not suggesting people should have to present photo ID or even government ID, but there are 39 forms of ID that are acceptable, of which 13 will provide people with an opportunity to prove where they live.
But Mr. Poilievre,
and that is a very reasonable expectation.
If I could find one expert in elections who could verify what you're saying, I would be delighted to have them on the program. But I have had the Chief Electoral Officer, the former Chief Electoral Officer, Harry Neufeld, the Chief Electoral Officer of Northwest Territories was on this week, the Chief Electoral Officer of British Columbia. All of them say that in an effort to crack down on what they see as fictional or hypothetical fraud that you're quoting, they say that consequence will be you will disenfranchise 120,000 people from voting.
And that again is hypothetical, because we know that 120,000 people roughly chose to be vouched for in the last election. Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't have provided one of 39 different options to identify who they are and another to identify where they live. We have a very long list that people can use, everything from a utility bill to a correspondence that comes with their old age security or employment insurance checks, or a whole other list that totals 39 from which people can choose to identify who they are and where they live. We think that's reasonable.
Mr. Neufeld has gone even further now. He is saying, and he just said before the show, not only will 120,000 voters who use vouching be disenfranchised if your bill is not amended, but though the elimination of the voter information cards, these VICs, he said if those are eliminated, Elections Canada tells him up to 400,000 people could be affected.
Well, I mean,
that's 520,000 people.
Elections Canada is coming out with different numbers now. The reality is the vast majority of Canadians were not eligible to use the voter information card in the last election. They've used it as a pilot project amongst a very small select group of voters. So most Canadians have never used the voter information card as a form of ID. And the Fair Elections Act for those people won't change anything. There is,
well, for the record, Elections Canada says 400,000 people used it in the last election.
So you're telling me that every single one of those 400,000 people have no other identification?
I'm telling you what Elections Canada is telling me. I'm just telling you they use it. I'm not saying they all will be disenfranchised, but potentially, sir.
I'll be honest with you. The more I hear from Elections Canada on this particular point, the more convinced I become that we need to get rid of vouching. And let me tell you why. We have a report here that is extremely damning of the administration that Elections Canada provided in the last
Harry
election.
Neufeld report? The guy that was on before that says you're misusing it?
50,000 cases of where vouching was misused, 165,000 serious errors in the last election by one agency, and Mr. Mayran treats it as though these are just minor
Mr. Poilievre,
administrative
I can't
problems.
let this go. You are repeating the same thing, and Mr. Neufeld himself was just on, and he's saying to you, stop twisting my words to justify your point. He says you're using selective quotations out of context. Does that not bother you? The author of the report is telling you to stop doing it.
You know what? If he didn't want to use the words, he shouldn't have written them. I'm quoting them as he wrote them, in context. And if he's changed his position, then he can publicly state so. But the reality is...
Here's my thing. Canadians are watching this, but when you're a minister, you put out a bill, you're trying to listen to Canadians. Time after time I'm watching committee, you're seeing the people in charge of Elections Canada, the former people in charge, not just vouching on a lot of issues. Here, look, here's the Chief Electoral Officer, Jean-Pierre Kingsley, on this program, talking about the desire to have the Chief Electoral Officer the ability to compel testimony to get at the root for investigations. Here's what he said.
We're finding through the robocalls investigation that we're not getting to the bottom of the issue. Okay? We've only gotten to one part of it. We simply have to get to there, and people are not telling us what they know, and we would want to compel them to testify about that. And I will also add, that power is being requested with a court order.
So I'm just saying, whether it's vouching, compelling testimony, there is a litany of things Mr. Mayran said, and it seems to me that every major person who runs an election is telling you, Mr. Poilievre, slow down. Listen to the criticisms. There's some good things in the bill. There's some bad things. Amend the bill. And they would say, why aren't you listening to the people who run the elections?
Well, I have no power to amend a bill. It's going to be the committee of
but you could
parliamentarians.
say, I'm open. Are you open to amending on vouching? Are you open to amending on any of these issues?
I believe that we've made the right policy decisions on this bill, and I stand by them. I think they're supported by the evidence. Now,
but
just because...
even in the face of all the criticism,
yes,
it hasn't swayed you one bit.
I think that we've made the right decisions on these matters. And look, we live in a democracy. All these people are welcome to have their opinion. Of course, we're listening to their opinions. I was aware of Mr. Neufeld's, Mr. Kingsley, and Mr. Mayran's opinion before I introduced the bill. None of their opinions are new or have changed since that introduction. But I happen to disagree with them, and that
so what's the purpose of having hearings at committee if you're not open to preparing to change your mind?
That too is part of democracy.
So what's the purpose of a committee if you won't change your mind, if you're not open to changing your mind?
Listen, I said from the beginning, if someone comes forward with a good idea, of course we'll be open to hearing it out.
All right. Listen, you've always been good with your time, and I appreciate you coming on. Minister Poilievre, good to have you.
I enjoy the show. Thanks for